the pressure being the last session of the day. I know for you guys being here on a Saturday, it really shows how dedicated you guys are to learning. I'm excited to be here with you. My name is Dr. Unruh. Unruh, yeah, right there, it's UNRUH. I've been teaching for about 12 years. I teach environmental science as well as AP Physics 1. I'm actually an ecotoxicologist by trade, so in the Houston area where I'm from, I do a lot of studies with some of the salt marshes and looking at the relationship between those and some of the Superfund sites. So we look at how some of the heavy metals that have kind of leached off of those, how they're able to be absorbed by different plants to help kind of remediate the soils in that area. So I get really excited talking about the environment. I have lots of fun stories. I don't normally talk, like lecture really in terms of my class, so this is always a little weird for me. So please do engage, ask questions. I'll tell you guys some fun stories, try to gross you out a little bit as we talk, to make it a little bit more fun. One of the things that I do want to do, make sure we do, is that we're able to answer any questions you guys have about this as we go. So please ask those questions for clarification if you want me to give you more examples or things like that. In thinking about the two topics we're going to look at here, ecology and biogeochemical cycles, about how long ago did you guys kind of study those units?
Ecology, like this week.
So ecology you just did. What about like nitrogen carbon cycle?
2 weeks ago.
Okay. Are there anything from those units that you guys studied that you're still kind of feeling kind of unsure of or want to spend a little bit more time on?
The chemical cycle.
The chemical cycles? Now for those, there's like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water. Is there any particular ones or? Phosphorus, okay. And nitrogen, those are the kind of the two big ones, all right?
We all failed the test in our class. Everyone failed it.
Well, we'll make sure we get to that and make sure we get there, ask questions that you guys stuck on or things like that so we can kind of help you with that. All right, so thinking about that, if we look at the word ecology, how do we figure out what the word ecology means? Okay? Ooh, that's the tricky one. We always know what eco is associated with, but what does eco actually mean?
Like all these environmental factors
Biotic.
Kind of, you're getting there. So we know ology is the study of, but what does the prefix eco mean? It's actually kind of weird because we always talk about it like eco means like for the environment, but it actually comes from the Greek word oikos, which means house. So when we look at it, it's the study of our home or the place where we live, right? So even when we look at the word ecosystems, we're looking at the systems of how things in our home interact, right? So that's where the prefixes come from. So as you use that, you can kind of use your knowledge of what prefixes mean. Like, you know, bio means what? Life, living things, right? So you can use those prefixes to put words together. Same with the suffixes. All right, so in this picture, what do you guys see in that picture? It is a coral reef, but what looks odd about it? It's bleached. So what are the types of things that can cause a coral reef to be bleached? Right. Maybe the amount of sunlight, the water levels drop. And corals are actually a very sensitive type of organism. They have a very low range of tolerance. So even temperature changes as small as 1 degree can cause them to die. So when we look at all these sudden die-outs in the oceans, that's a hint to us that there's some pretty significant changes happening because the ocean is a very big heat sink. It takes a lot of energy to raise or lower the temperature of water. So when that starts happening, we have to really look at what's happening in the bigger system. Okay. So, from middle school, from a long time ago, you guys have been talking about levels of organization, right? We talked about how we go from molecules, all the organelles, the cells, the cell systems, to organisms, all the way up to your biosphere. When we look at different species, though, what is it that makes a species different?
They can't reproduce.
Well, it's not necessarily that they can't reproduce, because if I have like a red squirrel and a gray squirrel, those are two different species. They could mate and produce offspring. But what's special about their offspring? That's the key right there, is that their offspring are infertile. They can't produce babies. It's just like if I mate a lion and a tiger, right, I get a liger, but we don't have natural populations of ligers roaming around, right, even though they look cool, and that would be really awesome, because ligers are infertile, or even the tigons, depending on which way you mated them, right? We don't find them in the wild. The what?
That's a name.
Yes. Depending on depending on which one is a male, which one is a female. Like if you do a zebra and a donkey, you can either get a zonkey or a zadonk.
So like the two different squirrels that you were talking about, they wouldn't produce fertile offspring.
If they're different species, no. If it's just a coloration difference, then they could. Like if you're looking at, some species have like the males are kind of the brighter color and the females are more the dull. But if you're looking at, they're actually two distinct species, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. So like another example would be like polar bears, right? Polar bears, because of loss of habitat, are being pushed further south. So polar bears come in contact with like a grizzly bear or a brown bear, they can reproduce and have babies, and we end up with growler bears. But growler bears are infertile, so they can't reproduce to have more offspring. So that's kind of how it works when you look at those species that are close enough where their genetics are compatible, but they can't produce fertile offspring. Okay. So when we look at an ecosystem, we have abiotic and biotic factors. So what's the difference between those two?
Abiotic is non-living and biotic is living factors.
Good. So abiotic is non-living, biotic is living. So in this particular ecosystem, what kind of biome am I looking at right here? A desert, okay. So what are some of the abiotic factors that you see?
The rocks.
Rocks?
The dirt.
The dirt maybe, okay, parts of the dirt? The what? So the shadows tell you what? The amount of light, right? That's an abiotic factor. Light isn't living, okay? What else? I'm sorry? Well, we can't, but can we infer that it's there?
There's plant life.
It's kind of, we took a picture of it, it's just kind of one of those things you see without really seeing, right? Yeah, we have air that's present, right? Maybe not necessarily oxygen, but we can say that there's air, right? What else can we also infer might be in that air? Maybe?
Oxygen.
What would, ooh, that's a good one. Water, your moisture, right? That's one of the things that maybe we know is present in some level because there's plants there, right? So it has to be present in some capacity. Okay, what about the biotic factors? What do you guys see?
Lizard.
See a bird? A couple lizards? And cacti?
Scorpion.
There's a scorpion. We have some grasses, right? Some scrub brush. Those type of things. Does anybody know what desert we're looking at here?
Sahara.
It's not the Sahara.
Just guess.
That's a good guess.
Arizona.
Is it Arizona?
It is in Arizona and Texas, but it's actually not called the Arizona desert.
It's called the one in
It has to do, anybody remember the Taco Bell dog?
Yes. What's a dog for Taco Bell?
It's the Chihuahuan desert is what this is a picture of.
I never knew that.
It's actually West Texas and it kind of goes west of the way. I know, almost all what's that? So this is actually a picture of the Chihuahuan desert here, right? And depending on where we're at, those biotic and abiotic factors are going to influence what types of organisms can survive. The Chihuahuan desert does have a higher level of plant diversity because it does get a little bit more moisture than some of the other deserts. But it has some other unique features as well. They like to use the Chihuahuan desert a lot in examples on the AP exam. Okay, so when we talk about these organisms and how they survive in their environment, one of the things that we'll look at is what is their niche in the environment. What conditions do they need and what part of the environment can they exist in? So if I look over here, I have a couple of different kinds of barnacles. Okay, I have these brown guys right here and I have these blue guys over here. Now, the brown barnacles, their fundamental niche, or where they can survive, actually encompasses the whole range of what you're seeing here. Okay? So why do you think do I not find any brown barnacles down here? Well, we know that they can, because their fundamental niche covers this range. So why wouldn't I find them down here? What do you think? I heard somebody say it was a C word. Competition, right? That means that something about these blue barnacles is keeping the brown barnacles from being able to survive there. And when you actually look at the particular species that this is, the Balanus barnacles, they actually have a feature that when they grow, their shells actually grow on the surface and they can actually grow underneath other barnacles and actually eject them out of the environment. So they're actually able to kick them out. So why don't I have the blue barnacles all the way up here? if you look at, notice that, remember I said that the brown barnacles, their fundamental niche is here. The blue barnacles, their fundamental niche only ranges from here to here. So they've realized their entire fundamental niche. They've survived in the entire thing. But they can't survive up here, probably because they can't last for the long exposure without being submerged in high tide. Right? They're not able to survive outside of the water that long. Okay, so when we're looking at a fundamental niche, that is the range that the organism can survive. Okay, the realized niche is the one where it actually lives in. In the case of the blue barnacles, those are the same. But in the brown barnacle, they're only existing in the very top part of their fundamental niche. Okay? All right. So another way we can kind of distinguish some of the different niches that organisms take is based on whether they're a generalist or a specialist. So why would a raccoon be considered a generalist?
They can live in many different areas.
Right, they can eat anything, they can live in lots of different areas, all those types of things. I will tell you my funny story with this is that when I first moved to Texas, I lived in an apartment complex, and there was this lady who was pretty much blind, super old lady, super sweet. But she was telling me about this cute little cat that came to her house every evening. And so we were at the mailbox one day, and I was walking back, I was coming home late from work, and I could hear this weird sound. It sounded like a cat purring, but I had cats, so I knew it wasn't a cat. And so I turned around, and she's like, oh, look, here comes my kitty cat. And there was this, like, 40-pound raccoon that came walking up. And it was making a sound like it was purring. I don't know how it made the sound, but it figured out a way to make the sound where this lady thought it was a cat. So she went in and got this bowl of cat nuggets and brought it out for her raccoon, which is like, that explains why it's like this giant raccoon. And then just sat there and grabbed some food, and she would be like, oh, isn't it such a cute kitty? And I did not have the heart to tell her it wasn't a kitty cat. She didn't let it go in her house or anything, so I wasn't worried about that. She just liked feeding it and having it come over. But the raccoons have adapted to really pick up on lots of different things. They pick up on both behavioral and environmental factors to be able to survive. They have all those YouTube videos of raccoons doing like jazz paws because people throw them food because they think it's cute. There's a Jack in the Box close to us where there's a family of raccoons that comes because when people come through the drive-thru, they throw french fries at them. So they learned and they can adapt and maintain that. So when we look at other organisms like the koala bear, why would the koala bear be a specialist? Yes, it's so specifically adapted, it only eats eucalyptus leaves. So if something were to happen to eucalyptus plants, the koala would disappear. Now, what's interesting about this is that we're actually still trying to find out how the koala got to be so specialized. Because it doesn't make sense that it eats eucalyptus leaves, because eucalyptus plants are probably the least nutritious plant you could find on the entire continent of Australia. So why were they pushed to be able to consume this one type of plant? Eucalyptus leaves are also very toxic. So they have to have very special bacteria to break it down so that they don't die from eating these leaves.
They don't have any competition with their food source.
They don't, right? No other animal eats it because it's stupid to eat it, because it doesn't have any nutritional value.
Does the plant take very low, like nutrients compared to others?
No, I mean the plant itself is like a normal plant. Just the leaves themselves have very little nutritional value for the animals to be able to take in. And they're so specialized that here's one of those growth stories. You think about, in order for a koala to get the bacteria to break down the eucalyptus leaves, how do you think it gets it?
Yeah.
What do you think? Do what? No, not mutations.
Like on the plane.
You're right, it is, yeah. So when you look at, a lot of times we think about babies, right? They aren't born with the natural bacteria in their gut in order to do that, so they have to get it a different way. A lot of organisms, the moms may regurgitate food and they eat it that way. The koala bear had to be a little bit different. So mama koala bears, when they have babies, the consistency of their fecal matter changes. And it changes to this kind of green goo, which they feed to their babies. So that's how they're able to get the bacteria into their stomach. Like it would start being able to digest those
poor babies. There's like they don't know.
So there is your fun story for every time you look at a koala bear, you know that at some point you'll eat it.
You ate crap.
Alright.
Don't even.
So when we have these resources that are needed by different organisms, we have competition. But we have two kinds of competition. We have intraspecific and we have intra interspecific competition. So what's the difference between those two?
Spans across multiple species with interest within the species. Competition.
Yes.
So like interstate is like the last guy explained it like an interstate, and so I-12 goes through many different states and highways.
Good. Another way that I kind of remember the difference between the two is an intraspecific is in between a single species. Interspecific is between two different species. So that it has the A in it, you're talking about competition within a single species. Okay? What types of things would organisms that are in the same species compete for? Habitat, food, water, mates. You know what?
Oh no, I said
Oh, space. And what?
Space.
Space, right? All those kind of standard things. What about what types of resources would two different species compete for? Food still? Habitat? Probably not ants. Maybe if we're talking about the two squirrels, right? But otherwise, usually not. Maybe water, right? Those kind of basic needs. Okay, but when we think about competition, is competition good for a population?
Yes.
So if you guys are competing for the same food source, is it good for you guys to have to fight over that food?
Yeah, it gives you better stuff.
So thinking about it for humans, you can kind of see it that way, but think about for organisms. If you're constantly having to fight and the males are competing and fighting with each other, is that good for your
Well, if you don't
population?
have predators, if you overpopulate and then just like kill everything.
Right, so if you think about it, if organisms get injured or die, right, that's bad for a population. Okay? Because it can mean that one can wipe the other one out. So when we look at how organisms compete for resources, they do have competition where they do fight and actually like physically fight for it. But they don't like to do that because that's a detriment to both populations. If organisms in each of those populations become injured, remember their goal is to produce and reproduce and pass on their genetic information. So if they have members of their population dying, then they can't do that. So this competitive exclusion principle really looks at when we have organisms that have an overlap in their niche where they're able to survive, they only compete long enough to kind of reach a stable kind of system. Right? So if you guys were all, like if I had a row of hot dog trees that were in the middle of this room,
Hot dog
right?
trees.
Hot dog trees,
That's
yes.
amazing.
It is, it'd be cool, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Hot dogs and trees. If we looked at that, you guys might fight over it initially. But remember that competition isn't going to be good. So you're going to find some way to figure out, okay, you guys can have those trees, and we're going to keep these trees over here. Or one of you's going to take over and push the other ones out of the area. Right? So you're not going to continue that competition because it's not good for the population over the long run. Okay? All right. If we look at this picture, what are some of the things that you guys see in that picture?
Clump.
I see a big clump right there in the middle. Okay. Lots of fish. Maybe. Look at your labels. What do they tell you about what you're looking at?
Is it temperature?
I see temperature. Okay. Stress. I see different levels of stress. Tolerance. What is it? This on the side.
Population size.
The size of the population. Okay. So this is representing in a couple of different ways some information about how these organisms adapt to different temperatures. Right. As I go from cold to hot, I have this optimum range of temperature for the fish, and you can see that in the population curve here. Now, what's another reason why the population curve could round out here instead of just keep going up to a super high spike? Hey, so what do we call that? The carrying capacity, right? There's something that's capping off that number of organisms that can survive in that particular area. Why is it that I only have a few organisms over here and over here?
They've adapted over time. They had to survive like outside of the optimal range.
Okay, so if fish could talk and I could ask these fish, would they prefer to live here or here? Where would they prefer to live?
Where they are.
In the optimum range. Okay? When you think about an organism, there's a difference between preference and tolerance, right? I would prefer to live here. But if I can survive here and there's not enough resources for me here, I can survive out in this outside range, right? Just like if we're looking at organisms that live in sediment or soil, those macroinvertebrates that they use to help you test for pollution. There are organisms that are pollution tolerant. That doesn't mean that they want to live in soil that's contaminated with pollution, but they're able to survive there when other organisms can't. So they will, but they undergo some level of physiological stress by living there. So they may not live as long, or they may not be able to produce as many offspring, or all those things that will impact the population over time. One of the other things to consider is when you have that carrying capacity, it's usually because there's some kind of limiting factor. Most of the time we think about a limiting factor in terms of not having enough of something. But a limiting factor could be that we have too much of something. Right? If we're looking in an aquatic environment and we have too much nitrogen, right, that could be toxic to the fish as well. So limiting factors could be too little or too much of a resource. Okay? Okay, predator-prey. Tell me what you know about predator-prey.
The predator eats the prey.
Predator eats the prey?
The predators determine the amount of prey.
Okay, so the predators influence the number of prey that we have. Right, the number of prey we have also influences the number of predators that it can support. When you look at the graph, what do you notice about the graph?
The higher the predator, the higher
The higher the prey, the higher the predator.
the higher the prey, the higher the predator, and the lower the prey, the lower.
So if we look at that, I see what you're saying in terms of the trend. Like we notice when there's high here, there's also, but isn't it at the same time? Like when I'm at this peak here, is the predator population at its peak also? It's close. So there's a little bit of a lag, right? Because if we think about it, if I have a lot of prey, what does that mean that the predators are able to do? Eat more, so they can reproduce more. But why do you think the rabbit population is able to spike up so quickly?
Because it's lower predator population.
Right, rabbits have a very fast reproductive rate. Female rabbits can have between 8 and 10 babies at a time, and they can reproduce sometimes 3 to 4 times a year. And they also reach sexual maturity in a matter of 3 to 6 months. Right, so that means you can get lots of bunny rabbits all at one time. But if you think about the lynx, how many babies does a lynx have usually?
Like
1 or 2, and they might have only 1 set of offspring per season. Right, so it takes their population a long time to go up. So you'll notice that there's a lag. The population spikes really quickly when there's almost no predators. The prey population goes up. But that means that now there's enough food to support a larger predator population. So it'll start to go down as the predator population goes up. Why do you think it might level off over here? Is there something else that happened around this time that might influence that?
probably.
Humans.
Maybe the rabbits were, wait, which one's rabbits?
Human influence?
Right, what
Rabbits
happened
were
around
hunted.
1900?
Great Depression.
Like in terms of humans, what was happening around that time?
Civilization.
Right, if you think about, this would have been when people were kind of more populating, we started figuring out how to log better and cut down some of the forests and things like that. So eventually we started having an impact where the rabbit population couldn't reach as high. So now they've kind of reached a stable fluctuation back and forth. We don't see these big spikes that we saw back in the 1800s. These numbers were actually gotten from fur trappers that lived in Canada at the time. So they had to keep very accurate records of how many animals they had captured during that time, and they were able to use that to extrapolate the number of organisms that lived there. Some other types of relationships that we'll look at that are always super fun to talk about are the symbiotic relationships. So as we look at these, I want you to tell me about what it means by that type of relationship, but I also want you to explain how this picture represents that type of relationship. So if we look at the first one for mutualism, tell me what that is and how does that picture represent?
It benefits both the bee and the plant.
They both benefit because the bee takes the pollen, so it can picks up pollen so it can make honey, and then it spreads pollen to the other flowers.
Right. And in addition to the pollen from the flower, what else does the bee get from the flower?
Nectar.
The nectar, right? So it takes the nectar and the pollen back, and it can use that to make honey. Why is it important that it picks up pollen to spread to other plants, though?
Reproduction.
Right. What type of reproduction do plants usually have?
They use
Asexual or sexual?
kind of sexual, because they have like the things that catch the pollen.
Right. If we think about it, what does asexual reproduction mean?
You break off.
They can do it themselves, right? Flowers have male and female parts in them. So why would the flower not just be able to fertilize itself? Right. Plants reproduce sexually, so they need the pollen or the sperm from other plants in order to produce its offspring. It needs that genetic variation. So bees provide that by transporting the pollen back and forth, and then it gets the resource out of it. So the next one we have here is commensalism. And I want to clarify, the two organisms we're looking at here is this cow and the bird over here. So what is commensalism and how does that picture show it? So one benefits and the other is not affected. So then how is that picture? Ooh, so if that was the case, if the bird is taking something off of the cow, that would help the cow, right?
Yeah.
So this can't be that one. So what do you think might be going on? Yeah.
The cow keeps up like the bugs whenever he walks and the birds eat them.
Yes. So this particular bird is a cattle egret. The one you're speaking about that actually eats the bugs off of the cow is called an oxpecker. So it actually goes through and eats parasites and stuff off of the cows. And that's actually something that helps the cow in that case. All right. So it is a clear, you want to make sure you look because this one, if it has the long neck, you're looking at the egret. The oxpecker looks more like a little finchy type bird. It's a little short, little tiny bird in order for it to do that. What's another example of commensalism that you see a lot of times as an aquatic example?
Oh, the shark.
Shark and it's not a cleaning fish. It was cleaning the shark. What kind of relationship would it be? Mutual. That would be mutual.
Oh.
Right, we're looking at the remoras, right? That's the name of the fish. They have a little suction cup that allows them to suck onto the shark, but it's not to clean it. It's literally just for transportation. Well, not protection. What does it get out of the shark? Why does it hitch a ride with the shark?
Food.
Food, right? Are sharks clean eaters?
No, they have no blood.
No, they rip stuff up and have little pieces that float everywhere. So the remoras hitch a ride, right? And then when the shark eats, it eats all the little nuggets that the shark misses, right? And it just kind of swims around. It doesn't care. Like, it's not big enough for it to really make a meal out of it, right? It's usually somewhere where it can see it. Would it eat it? Sure, you could get a hold of it.
Might be my stomach.
All right, what about this last one down here? Parasitism.
One benefits the other.
So when you say it's harmed, what does that mean?
Like it's negatively affected.
But how so?
It gets the blood sucked out of it.
Right, so it has nutrients being removed out of either the blood.
Leaching.
It could have its tongue eaten, maybe. Okay.
One of the fish. I don't know about that.
Yes, there's lots of different things. Anybody know what this is called?
No.
That's a really big leech if that's a leech.
It is not a leech. I
Yeah,
will tell
that's
you
not
that.
a
It's a different type of, is it eel?
It's a lamprey, is what it is.
Oh,
Right?
yeah.
They're the really creepy ones, and you look at pictures of them. Their mouths are these big.
They
things
get
that have
really
rows of
big.
teeth in there. Yeah.
Would a consumer eating an animal count as parasitism?
No, if it's consumed, that's when we're really looking at predator prey.
Oh,
So-
so it's like minorly negatively affected.
Yeah, so and that's kind of the difference there. When you look at a parasite, you're looking at the parasite and its host. Now, it doesn't benefit the parasite for it to kill the host. Now, sometimes it happens, but it's not the intent of the parasite. Like the lamprey isn't trying to kill the fish because then it loses its food source. It wants to take enough nutrients from it so that it can be satisfied, but so that the fish doesn't die, right? Because then it has to find a new host. And that usually takes more energy. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't there a type of like parasite that eats the tongue of the fish and it like replaces the tongue and then it eats with the food that the
Oh yeah, parasites, if you ever want to get into something really super interesting, if you get into parasitology at all, it is amazingly fun to read
It's
about.
gonna make me
Yeah, the monsters inside the plant.
It's gonna make me
I
paranoid.
can
Anybody here have dogs?
Yes.
Cardboard.
I have 2 dogs.
Have you ever seen your dogs rubbing their butt on the carpet?
Yeah.
Nope.
Well, if your dog does that, that could be a sign that it has a parasite. Because one of the parasites that's really common, especially for domestic animals, is a tapeworm. So a tapeworm, they eat the eggs of it through either being on plants or something that it ate because it gets deposited in the environment. If that happens, the eggs hatch while it's in the intestinal system. And tapeworms are also one of those really creepy looking ones. If you look at really close, they have these round kind of teeth everywhere. They have these hooks that as it passes through the digestive system, it hooks onto the side. Now that process doesn't necessarily hurt the animal in and of itself. It just kind of absorbs nutrients as the animal eats. But eventually they can get so long that the tail end of it actually hangs out the rear end of the animal. And that doesn't feel good. So the animals try to rub their butts on things and it breaks off pieces of the worm. Well, tapeworms are segmented worms. And those little segments they break off end up becoming egg pouches that become more worms later on. Now, if your dog does that, they could also be expressing their anal glands, which doesn't sound any better, but that's a natural process that's as well. That's one of the ways they can get it. Because tapeworms a lot of times are positive by fecal matter, and they've got on there. Yeah. Okay. keystone species. Where have you guys heard that word before?
Like
Yellowstone wolves, good.
The starfish.
Starfishes, alligators. Where does the word keystone come from though?
The keystone
Like an
arch.
The arch, right? Romans, when they built arches, they didn't use mortar to hold the arches together, right? They cut the stones and stacked them, and they put the keystone in the middle. That held the arch together. Where if you remove that keystone, the whole arch would collapse.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing with the keystone species. It's not necessarily that they're the apex predator of the system, but they're the critical piece there where if you remove that, the entire ecosystem could collapse. So with the red sea star, these guys eat a very particular kind of mussel that are able to reproduce very, very quickly, to the point where they would take over the environment if the red starfish wasn't there to eat them. But the red starfish keeps that particular kind of mussel in check, so you have a higher diversity in that ecosystem. Another one, anybody here have little brothers or sisters that watch Octonauts? So if we think about some other kinds of keystone species, there's an episode about one of them, and we look at the kelp forest. Because otters are a keystone species for the kelp forest. They actually eat the red sea urchins that eat the base of the kelp. When that happens, it kills the kelp and would destroy the forest. So otters keep that population in check so that the kelp forest is able to stay healthy. But yes, the alligator, you guys mentioned one of the wolves in Yellowstone. There was a whole video about how the wolves were able to reshape the rivers and stuff like that. Yep, very good. Food chains and food webs, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. A couple of things. What does the arrow indicate in a food web?
Energy flow.
The direction of the energy flow. Between heterotrophs and autotrophs, what's the difference between those two?
Autotrophs make their own food, heterotrophs consume other animals.
Good. Sometimes you may see them specifically talk about a particular kind of autotroph called a chemotroph. Those are organisms that live like in the deep ocean vents that don't have access to sunlight. They use chemicals from the deep ocean vents in order to produce their own food. So autotrophs, most of the time, we're considering photosynthetic organisms, but you do have some that are able to do that with chemicals in the deep ocean vents. Okay, with trophic structures, these kind of pyramids you can see used in different ways. If they're representing energy, they pretty much look the same no matter what type of food chain you're looking at. Same thing with biomass. What does biomass mean? Right, the amount of biotic matter that's in that particular level of the ecosystem, right? That's pretty much going to be the same no matter what. What starts to look different is we start to look at the number of organisms. If we represent it with the trophic structure, that can look a little bit different. In a traditional food chain, if I have a plant, a rabbit, and a fox, I have lots of plants, fewer rabbits, and even fewer foxes. That kind of creates that same structure. But if I have a food chain like this one, where I have the plant, and then I have a little tiny bug called an aphid that lives on the plant, you could have thousands of aphids on a single plant. So your number of organisms, you're going to have more of those than you would your producers. So you get that kind of inverted triangle.
I've actually never seen it.
That would be good one.
That's pretty cool.
Then you also have the ladybug that eats the aphids, so there's going to be fewer of those. You'll kind of notice you have the skinny parts on the top and the bottom. We also have this other kind here, where here we have the plant, then we have the caterpillar, so there has to be lots of plants to support the caterpillars, right? But the parasitic wasp preys on the caterpillars, right? And the way they prey on them is they actually, when they land on them, they inject their eggs inside the caterpillar, and then when the eggs hatch, they eat the caterpillar from the inside out. So there tends to be more parasitic wasps than there are caterpillars. In Texas and even here in Louisiana, there's another type of parasitic wasp that does the same thing with cockroaches. So they land on a cockroach and they inject their eggs inside the head of the cockroach, and then they hatch and kill the cockroach that way. Yeah. Right. Questions? Do you have a question?
Yeah, is biomass the amount of species or the weight?
It's the amount of matter that's there. So like if you were to be able to collect all the plant matter and find out what the mass was, that's what that represents. If you were able to take all the primary consumers and get the mass of all of them in an ecosystem, that's the biomass.
So you could have like a ton of small aphids, and that would still be about the same as like a couple birds.
Right.
Got it.
Yep. And then also, when you actually do studies with biomass, usually you even like take out like water, because the water is not really considered like a biotic component of that. So when you think about larger organisms like us, we're mostly water. So if you were to dry us out and measure just the amount of matter that was there, that's what they were looking at for biomass. Okay, ecological succession. So when we look at this, remember this is a very, very slow process. And the key with primary succession is we start with bare rock. So in an ecosystem, what would need to happen to return the environment to bare rock?
Volcano,
A volcanic eruption, good. What else?
tsunami, like
Maybe. But a tsunami, if the wave comes and destroys everything, most of the time the soil is still there, it's not rock, right?
Erosion.
You what?
Erosion.
Maybe erosion, right? If we had a big mudslide or a rock slide and it exposed the
Dust
bedrock
bowl.
underneath it, it could be.
Dust bowl.
That's going to come to the other one. So with primary succession, the key is we have to have the bare rock. When you look at human habitation, what do humans like to pour a lot of?
We like pouring fertilizer on stuff.
Well, think about like even here, where all the cars are parked. Concrete, right? That's rock, right? So places where people are, if people disappear, the environment has to go through and take time to break down that rock and turn it back into soil. That takes a lot longer than with secondary succession where you have just the dirt that's left over. So that's like where you might have a tsunami that might wipe out all the plants. What other types of events could cause secondary successions after start over? I know California is kind of experiencing this right now. Wildfires, right? That can reduce all the plants down just to the surface, but there's still soil remaining. What else? What do you think?
A nuke, or like Chernobyl blowing up.
Maybe. We're probably not going to have much throwback after that, but we could.
Earthworms, you get.
Maybe. You mentioned tsunami. You heard tornado even. I know in Texas we had a couple hurricanes that hit us
Oh,
last
so then
year.
it was tsunami.
Right, rock slides, mudslides, all those things. As long as there's soil left, then you're going to have secondary succession start. That happens much quicker because the soil is already formed. Right, you just have plants growing in, and we end up moving to our climax community, which is going to be different depending on where you are. And where we are in southeast Texas, and well, not probably similar here, we're kind of the bottomland hardwood forest. We have lots of pine trees. We don't have very many deciduous trees though. But if you go up to New England, you're going to have lots of maple, lots of oak, the trees that lose their leaves every year, right? When we look at biomes, what are the two factors that determine a biome?
Rainfall and the temperature.
Right, that's going to be the two big influences. Now, some of those are impacted by its latitude as well. Like the farther north you get, it's going to be colder. That's going to make it more your tundras or whatnot up there. When we look at generally, though, we typically use your temperature and your precipitation to help us kind of determine what biome we're looking at. What's the difference between climate and weather?
Climate's long-term patterns of weather, and weather's just short-term.
Right, we know, especially in the last week, that weather can change pretty dramatically from one day to the next. We can go from 80 degrees to 40, right? So when we talk about long-term patterns of weather, though, what do we mean by long-term?
It's an average of 30 years.
It's 30 years or more.
Right, long periods of time. Sometimes for humans, it's hard for us to wrap our head around what long-term means, because for us, a couple of years feels really long. But it's really not long enough to pick up on patterns. We're typically talking about, hundreds of years. Let's look at the trends that we see over time. Okay, good. All right, when we look at the edge of two biomes, right, where they kind of overlap, just like when we look at a map and we're looking at the boundary of a state, there's not a magical line on the ground where organisms from one biome are going to cross over into the other. Right, we have that kind of transition that happens as we shift from one biome to the next. We call that an ecotone. And what's interesting about ecotones is they have higher levels of diversity. You have more numbers of different species because they're able to kind of move over into that, and some from each are able to go into the same environment. So we end up with higher levels of diversity in those transitional areas than in either one of the original biomes. Okay. All right, our biogeochemical cycles. So nitrogen. Where do we find most of nitrogen in the environment? In the atmosphere. Can we use it while it's there? No, it's in an inusable form. Every time you're breathing in lots of nitrogen that you don't do anything with. And you breathe it right back out. Approximately what percent of the atmosphere is in nitrogen? Yeah, it's like 70%, like 3/4 roughly. Right? Some huge number that doesn't make any sense. Why how do we figure out a way to use it?
Why
Right?
couldn't we just use nitrogen instead of oxygen?
That would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? That would be awesome.
Dinosaurs.
So, when we look at the amount of nitrogen that's available, how does it get to the usable form? By bacteria. Right? In our first step, we have what we call nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are able to pull the nitrogen from the atmosphere, right, from the air, and start bringing it into the soil. One of the reasons why when you study soil types, why this becomes an important factor in figuring out what types of plants can survive there, is that when you look at soils that have a lot of clay, there isn't a lot of room in the soil for air. So there's not a lot of way for the nitrogen to get into the soil. So that can influence how many plants you're able to support. Then we have bacteria that take it from the atmosphere that start to turn it into ammonia, right? That process is called ammonification. We're making ammonia, okay? Once it does that, there's more bacteria that starts to break it down because ammonia by itself is toxic in the environment. High levels of ammonia means it will kill organisms. When you establish a fish tank, right, you start off, especially if you put a goldfish in there, goldfish produce a lot of ammonia. That's why fish tanks smell when you first set them up. Okay, but over time, the bacteria will break down the ammonia into the first part of the nitrification where it makes it into the NO2 ion. What is that NO2 ion called?
Nitrite.
Nitrite. Okay, so the first step, it breaks it, or it transforms it into ammonia. Then it goes to nitrite. Nitrite is also still toxic for the environment. Plants can't use it yet. Okay? The bacteria continue working on it in the process of nitrification, add more oxygen, and eventually it becomes NO3, which is nitrate. That is the usable form for plants. So plants can uptake NO3 and use it and assimilate it into their bodies. Okay? So I know that's not labeled on here, but once it's transformed into NO3 and it enters back into the food web through plants, that process is called assimilation. Okay? Now, organisms still end up returning nitrogen to the soil because think about us, when we, after we consume things, we have to eliminate waste. Our waste is eliminated in the form of, some of it is in the form of ammonia, so it gets returned back and that has to be broken down again by bacteria. When we have the nitrates that are taken up, sometimes they're so in excess that it actually gets released back into the environment as nitrogen gas. That process is called denitrification. So we remove the oxygens back off so that it can be released back to the environment. So we go from gas in the atmosphere, nitrogen, pull it down and fix it into the soil. The ammonification turns it into ammonia. Nitrification starts adding oxygens by turning it into nitrite, and then nitrate, where it usually goes back and enters into the ecosystem. Right? When you buy fertilizers for plants, you'll find those letters NPK on the bags of fertilizer. So nitrogen, the P stands for phosphorus, and the K is potassium. Those are three crucial nutrients for plants, and the levels that's required is going to be a little bit different. Some plants need more phosphorus or more potassium than others, but all of them need pretty high levels of nitrates. When Americans first came, or when Europeans first came to the Americas, one of the things that Native Americans taught them is about the three sisters. Right? They had three sets of plants that they always grew together. They grew beans, right? Because beans are legumes are one type of plant that can actually return nitrogen to the soil. They grew those, and they did that because corn is a very nitrogen-intensive plant. It needs a lot of nitrogen to grow. And then the squash that they grew shaded the area to keep weeds from growing. So they grew those three plants together to kind of perpetuate that nitrogen cycle within their areas they were planting. So that all happens there. We have other influences. Remember, when we have nitrogen that's introduced through fertilizers, if we get too much nitrogen in the water, what starts to happen? We start to get algae, right? Algae, if we get too much of it, when it dies, what happens to the algae that dies? Well, it has to decompose, right? Bacteria have to break down the dead algae. Well, guess what the bacteria need to survive? Oxygen. So if that happens, you start to get that eutrophication of the water. The algae starts to die, and then the water loses all its oxygen, so anything else that depended on oxygen in the water also can die. So that becomes particularly problematic, especially along the Mississippi River, because of all the agriculture that's along the river system. Anytime it rains, that water all funnels into those water systems and creates those kind of toxic plumes. That's why when we get to the Gulf of Mexico, what happens at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico? There's the dead zone from all that decomposing that's going on. Okay. All right, phosphorus cycle. Oh, one other thing. The nitrogen cycle. We talked about a lot of steps going on right here, but this is actually a very quick cycle. When you start a fish tank, it takes less than 2 weeks to cycle it from ammonia to nitrates. And once the bacteria is established, it will continue to happen ongoing. So this process happens very, very quickly. Okay? That's very different than the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle takes a very, very long time to happen. Okay, the key difference between this one and this one is there is no atmospherical component for phosphorus. Phosphorus is not found as a gas. That means it's only found in rocks and soil that has to be dissolved through water or other means before it can be used. So it has to be broken off of the rocks and changed into other forms that are usable by the plants. Okay, those are the two big differences with those two cycles. Is nitrogen happens very quickly, phosphorus takes a really long time. Nitrogen is found in the atmosphere, phosphorus is not. Okay? You have to have it picked up and carried off by streams and whatnot in order for it to be used. Okay? Questions on that one? When it says an aerosol, what does that mean? Does that mean it's a gas?
It's a little tiny dust particles.
Right. So when you look at an aerosol, like one of the ways when you start looking at immunology, when you talk about the cold and the flu virus being spread, those are spread through bioaerosols. Okay, so as I'm talking right now, believe it or not, all of you are inhaling my spit. Because as I speak, microscopic little droplets of the water that I've exhaled that have been in my body are being dispersed out through the room. So inside those water droplets, if you have a disease like an influenza virus, it can hitch a ride in those water droplets. And then as you inhale it, that's how we spread those types of diseases. So with phosphorus, when we talk about an aerosol, we're not talking about it being turned into a gas. But if it's injected in the rocks from volcanoes, it can hitch a ride in the dust until it settles somewhere else. So an aerosol does not mean it's a gas. It means that it's a very small solid particulate. Okay, that can hitch a ride. It can be in clouds and things like that as well. Okay, so an aerosol does not mean a gas, but it means that it can be expelled and in the air in the form of a solid particulate. Okay. Let's see. All right. Any other questions with those two? I know those are the two big ones you guys said you wanted to kind of focus on. All right, carbon cycle. What's our big concern with the carbon cycle?
Too much or too little.
When we look at our greenhouse gases that are related to the carbon cycle,
CO2.
we have CO2, but what's one that's actually a stronger greenhouse gas in terms of making the environment heat up more? It's another carbon compound, but it's not carbon dioxide. It's methane, right? That's one of the reasons why you hear a lot of people talking about regulating cows and whatnot. Because what do cows do a lot of? They burp and they fart. All of those release methane into the environment, and methane is a much stronger carbon or greenhouse gas. Another reason why they're concerned about things like the ocean water temperatures increasing is because in the oceans we have a large carbon sink of not just carbon dioxide but also methane. So if the water gets warm enough, that methane and that carbon can start to be released from the oceans, and that would be a bad thing because that would accelerate the greenhouse effect even more. Okay, water cycle. Lots of different parts here. I know you guys have had this since like middle school, right? Lots of different parts there. When we talk about water being taken from plants and released back into the atmosphere, what do we call that process? Going from plants to the atmosphere. Transport. I think it's a transcription for a second. I was like, hold on, that's the wrong one. Transpiration, good. When we look at how the water goes into the ground systems, what do we call it when it goes into the ground systems?
I can't think of it right now. Infiltration.
Infiltration, good, right? If you go into kind of the middle of Texas, I know around San Antonio, they have lots of areas that are natural infiltration zones that feed into aquifers, right? Remember that means that you have enough porous rock that it collects, and that's how it's actually a direct path for it to get into the groundwater systems. Can you get pollution in groundwater systems?
Yes.
Fertilizers.
You can
You get fertilizers, good. When those go through the groundwater systems, what tends to happen to those pollutants? If you have pollutants that get into the groundwater, do they stay there the whole time? They could. But what does the groundwater do? It runs. Mm-hmm.
It's a source in the fresh water.
It could.
Rivers.
Yeah.
Right, because if you think about it, when the water runs through the groundwater, what's happening to it?
Picks up minerals.
It could pick up minerals or it could lose things as well, right? One of the reasons why we call like these mountain streams like clean water is because the groundwater system has essentially filtered the water. Right? You can create your own water filters by taking like a bucket and putting in different layers of different types of dirt that help kind of collect out particulates. You can have activated charcoal in there to remove chemicals. You can actually clean water by running it through a groundwater system. But what that does is that contaminates the soil that's there as well. So we do have to be mindful of when we're drilling for things or taking out groundwater, that we're creating ways for the pollutants to get into the groundwater systems as well. This became really important, especially in the areas in the Northwest where they were starting to do a lot of fracking. Right? As they did that, when they were fracking, they were releasing a compound into the groundwater systems. You've ever seen the videos of the people that were able to light their faucet water on fire?
That's
That was in
right.
Michigan.
It's in a lot of places, yeah. Because when they are fracking, because they're injecting water in there, they're doing it to release a gas. Well, if that gas gets into the water, you actually get like benzene and other chemicals that are highly flammable in the water. It's pretty crazy stuff. There's a good movie. It's called Gasland that you can watch. This guy drives around to see people that were impacted by different fracking companies in terms of how it infiltrated the groundwater system. Kind of like the Lorax, yeah. Gotta take care of the trees.
Except it's the water.
Well, they're all related, though, aren't they? Okay. Let's see. So our big picture, kind of the three big things from all this information. Right, we talked about how all those biological systems interact. And that, remember, nothing is as simple as just a simple food chain. Right? We don't really find just a food chain in nature. We have these really complex webs that have lots of things interconnecting. We have our keystone species in some of those ecosystems that play a very important role. And we're only just now kind of starting to understand the role of some of those keystone species when we start looking at those collapses like with the Yellowstone wolves, right? We know that we have abiotic and biotic factors that have all different kinds of ways of influencing our environment. When we look at different biome structures, we have to look at when humans start making those changes, how does it influence the plant and animal communities that are able to survive? If we are making the planet warmer or even colder, whichever way you want to look at it, how are those changes going to affect the environment long term when you have animals that have different levels of tolerance? Remember the coral reefs, those organisms have a very narrow zone of tolerance. So if those disappear with those small changes, how are we going to be able to adapt to that? Okay. Remember that we do have species that are better able to adapt than others, our generalists versus our specialists. Hopefully you guys remember your story from your specialist, so you probably remember for that for a long time, right? Going to the zoo will be fun. A little bit more, I can share that story with people. I think that pretty much wraps up what I have. Is there any last minute questions?
You're the first person that's finished.
Yeah.
This is the first one I finished before time, so. Probably I'm just as
Hey,
anxious
you've
to
got
drive home,
practice.
right?
You got like